Hello, my name is Michael Anthony. So my talk tonight is going to be a little different than the other talks. I think some of the other talks are more focused around like business type of driven applications. I focused more in creative applications. I worked at Soap Creative in Culver City, and we did a lot of stuff for video games, Activision, that kind of stuff. So this talk's kind of about the different things that I learned while working with that, and it was called JS to rule them all, which was like a weird joke. It actually should have been JS all the things, which I thought of like 20 minutes ago, and I wish I did it. But anyway, so the current state of affairs, as far as what I can see, there's desktop sites where like I had some examples on my iPad, but we had some technical difficulties. So quick example, this should work. One of the websites I actually go to all the time, NFL.com. Kind of this, it's just a lot of stuff smashed, like links everywhere, a few images, and what I feel, and TechCrunch was another example that I had. Is TechCrunch kind of the exact same thing, but then if you look at their mobile app, it's actually this really nice interface where you've got some stuff to the right, where you got some stories you want to read, and then to the left is your story, and it's actually like more focused. So I guess this is a bit about working how to work mobile into basically building one application that is your desktop site and your mobile site, but kind of thinks like mobile, where it's more focused and less like everything all over the place. Another example, or another thing on the list, is separate mobile sites kind of feel janky right now. I feel like the JavaScript that's used on mobile stuff, you go to swipe something and it's not like a mobile app where it sticks with your finger and you can see it moving around. It's like you do a swipe and then a weird second later it'll slide over. And I feel like that's kind of the norm, but it's really possible to create something that's not so janky. I spent a little time on that. I was going to demonstrate it. If anybody has an iPhone or whatever, just go to activetheory.net, and you'll see what I mean about that. And then, of course, the third thing is the native mobile app. So it's almost like everything's being treated as three separate applications, when my approach, that may not be right for everyone and is definitely a work in progress. It's not like this, hey, go out and start doing it this way. It's just something that I'm working on, and I haven't even fully achieved yet, is this idea to bring it all together. So yeah, so this annoys me really bad. Try to go to a mobile website, and a big thing comes over and it's like, download our app. And I'm like, no, we don't have to do this. So what can we do about it? Basically is just think about it differently, pretty much what I just explained, not in terms of separate websites, but one application that's aware of the device that it's being run on. So you may be familiar with the term write once, run everywhere, and that never works ever. So this is actually different. It's not writing once. It's basically combining multiple code bases into one application. And the way you would do that is just be aware of what device you're running on, be aware of the capabilities, and then all you have to do is then route your code to show the mobile view if you're on an iPhone and the desktop view if you're on a desktop. So how does it work? Now, something like this could get pretty messy, especially if you're just sticking with like just standard jQuery. So definitely recommend an MVC framework. It's pretty important because your models and controllers are pretty much going to be the same no matter what device this is on, but your views are going to be very different. Definitely identify device and capabilities. Writing controllers that present correct view for the applications being used on. And the big one here is coding flexible layouts. This is kind of a trick that I learned from Flash, was almost like those big, terrible, fluid Flash sites where like there's some weird stuff going on. It's always anchored to the top and all that. So learning that actually came in handy when doing this, because desktop sites, the resolution can vary, but it also helps with mobile because it could be an iPhone that it's the standard resolution for iPhone and that never changes, but then you've got an Android device and you've got every other device. So if it's flexible, you can almost make the system where It knows it needs to create a mobile view. It routes into that mobile view, but then that mobile view is flexible enough to basically take any shape on a mobile device. So the question is why? And I personally feel it would improve the user experience. I get pretty excited when I'm on my iPad, and I basically use if I'm not working, I use my iPad for everything. It's like a $500 Reddit machine. It just like, but when I click a link off of Reddit and I get to a website and it actually is like formatted nice for the iPad, I'm actually pretty excited about it, except for that one terrible like WordPress template that's just like a janky news scroller and it like snaps and gets all weird. I see that one a lot, but the idea of creating applications instead of web pages, it helps narrow the focus and engage users. And the important thing here is the users are able to then walk away with something useful. The idea of mobile applications, it's not so much, I'll give you a perfect example. So one campaign that we did for a particular movie, it's basically just a static page and it's got some quotes from the movie. And that's what the brands, that's what like the big brands are thinking of as far as desktop. It's almost like two different ways of thinking. And that's terrible. I mean, that's terrible. You're not getting anything out of it. It's bad. But on mobile, we built a mobile application that allows you to, like, I would have showed this one as well, but it would allow, it's for a video game called Darksiders. It's out right now. It's called Darksiders Soul Harvest if you want to check it out later. Essentially what it does is it allows you to see the map, see where you are, and see all the places around you, and you can harvest souls from, 20 people checked in here or whatever. And there's not that many people using it, maybe like 10,000 people in the few weeks that it's been out, but there's been like 10 million souls harvested, so people are actually engaged because they're actually getting something of value out rather than just looking at something on the screen. So I'm trying to translate that into websites and web applications in general. By the way, I'll get to this at the end. This app was built it's essentially a mobile website in a titanium container with a few mobile components. But so what I mean by JS to rule them all and only using JS, partly mean you can use JS for mobile applications, but what I really mean is, and this is how I've ended up here. So basically, in the past, and people might be familiar with this, is you start out and you write like a ton of markup, and you've got markup for every single section of the website all at once in the body, and then you're just using selectors to pull them out. Then eventually, what I ended up doing was breaking it out into little templates, basically, mustache or however else you like to do it, and then inject that bit as you need it. What I've come to, in each view, I'm creating an element, styling it, and then appending it to its parent. Similar to Flash, you'd create a sprite, similar type of thing. What I've found so far is that it's easier to debug. It's extremely fast to develop. Like, I couldn't believe rather than having like an HTML file, a CSS file, and the JavaScript file, you do it all in JavaScript. And then if you know what view it's in, if you're sticking to the MVC pattern, you just dive to that view, make a change, whatever. Also, this helped a lot with scaling for mobile devices. You don't have to have like a million CSS, like media queries and all that kind of stuff. There are definitely some caveats with this in jQuery, which I'll get to in a sec. I just want to show this code real quick. So basically, this would be the jQuery version of this. You'd create a new page element, in this case a div. This would be a shortcut that I made. Size would set to 100 by 100, but that would also set the background scale property of it. So you could do setBG image if it was a Retina device, because you're already keeping track of device capabilities with this whole system. You know it's got a Retina screen. You would set the Retina version, and that would kind of cram the double res into the 100 by 100. And then you'd style it a little bit, and then append it to its parent. And basically, imagine this times everything you'd need to see on the screen. So you might even be thinking right now, wow, that's going to be pretty slow. And with jQuery, it actually wasn't terrible, except on mobile devices. On mobile, it was certainly more than usable. It was just that you'd kind of tap for a second, and it would take just a tiny fraction of a second to flip and load the new view, because it had to go through and create all these gigantic jQuery objects that are meant to be all things to all people, with every single method that's in the entire jQuery API being created over and over and over. So what I've done for that is I basically scrapped jQuery altogether. I use a framework that I've been developing over the past year, which is basically meant to help with this kind of stuff. I basically replaced jQuery objects completely, so it just creates a raw JavaScript object with like a simple wrapper similar to jQuery's API, but you can do simple things like styling, and it keeps this. I kept the same kind of syntax, and the memory usage is way lower. So it's actually really powerful how you tap and everything's instant. It actually works great. So moving on to not just about static pages. Again, I totally not speaking for every type of application you may ever need to build, but like I said, I specialize or have just only really worked with creative applications that basically flash without the flash. I mean, that's kind of where I've been at for the last year, which is getting old, but basically, but I've learned a few things. Bad animation can be distracting and get in the way, but good animation can be useful to invoke emotion and present hierarchy. At this point, I was going to show transformersgame.com. Was a website I worked on. A lot of transformery type of animation as you'd imagine for the game, but I was very mindful in that process to not go the flash route and then have this 10-second animation of the robot transforming before you can actually like do anything with him. So the animation on it is actually very quick. It's actually kind of cool, I think, but it kind of gets out of your way and lets you access the content. Another thing for me is getting rid of click, reload, and repeat, which is pretty much every website ever, which, you click it, it reloads some content, nothing animates. I found that you can use animation to bridge the gap between content presentation, and that goes towards presenting hierarchy and invoking emotion. With transformers, things transform a little bit. You're like, oh, that's cool, that's transformers. Presenting hierarchy, if you look at any native iOS app, it'll just, you tap to open an email and it slides over. That's showing you that you've gone deeper into the application. You need to hit back, it slides back. It almost gives you, like, in your brain, like a map of where you are as far as how you're using it, rather than if you just hit tap and then something loaded and then you hit back and then it refreshed kind of thing. The trick then is getting the best performance and getting the animations to not be choppy, especially on mobile devices, and this is what I found that works. So going back to detecting device capabilities, you want to check for CSS3 transitions. You want to check if it supports the translate 3D property. CSS3 transitions, the most performance, you can get the most performance out of a transition by doing it that way. I also, since this is only, I'm using only JS, it's applied with JS. So if you're familiar with jQuery's .animate function, I have a very similar one called .tween. And what that will do is, depending on, is it an old version of Internet Explorer, then it'll, every frame update the left and top property. But if it's a new browser, it'll use the translate property. And that'll lead me into, for desktop, I found using top and left to animate things around actually works better than trying to do translate. Especially in Firefox, you get a bit of weird aliasing and things flickering. But on mobile devices, it's absolutely essential. If you just do a quick test where you set a tween on a left and top of just a box on an iPad, it'll be a little choppy. If you do it with Translate X, you'll know it's the same animation that you get in a native app, which is actually pretty incredible. So the last thing is use Canvas only where absolutely necessary, and that's just going to, I think, with Easel.js, there's this new thing that it's like, oh man, it's Flash again, because it was Grant Skinner and he does all this incredible Flash stuff. They've almost taken that whole API and brought it over to Canvas, and now you can create a sprite and basically code exactly like you would code Flash. The problem with that is you really shouldn't use that to do layouts. Using CSS3 transitions, you're able to get basically native performance on any device you're on. So you kind of want to stay away from Canvas, but you want to do cool things like particle effects. I mean, I use Canvas all the time for stuff, but try to keep the rendering area small as you possibly can. Trying to render a full screen canvas obviously is a lot more pixels than trying to render a small area. So now with all of this, there's a few other considerations. Content management and SEO are big things in this system. Now, we're basically using hash bang URLs because you're animating between sections. You're not reloading the page. So quick thing is you can actually use something as simple as WordPress to manage your content. And all you'd really need to do is create a template that would allow you to grab your data out as a JSON object. You pull it into a model, and you would then have access to it in your application. So with WordPress, for example, it's pretty simple. You create a custom admin page. You say, I need a title and a path to an image, whatever. When the application loads, or if you prefer to load it, grab different bits of data at different times, you just make a request to that, to like whatever URL is /data, for example, and that would echo out the proper JSON encoded data. Serving JSON data and using models to store within the application. Right, cool. So then the only other issue that we run into with this system is search engine optimization. It's actually pretty simple. I was going to type, but since I can't type, if we can imagine like using a hash bang, you'd have like hash bang /about for your about page. Google will recognize that, and it will make a request to it will replace the hash bang. So if your site was like google.com/ escaped fragment equals, and then it'll pass in the string it's looking for. So in this case, /about. Sorry, I know it's kind of hard to follow along. I don't have anything to type with, but in that case, you can just all your CMS has to do is route that information. Instead of presenting the application itself, it routes that to just another view. And this actually helps because you can then serve up any markup and CSS you want, representative of the content Google's looking for, of course, but now be able to separate your presentation data. And in this case, it's pretty much just all divs because in this way, I'm just creating objects and styling them and appending them to the DOM. This way, you're actually able to use proper semantic headers and nav and stuff like that. And it'll actually benefit you more, I feel, rather than trying to like style your semantic data. And I found that this actually does work pretty well. But again, working with microsite type, I'm working more with microsite type of stuff, not giant applications. So your mileage may vary. So cool, mobile applications. So now at this point, we figured out how to get like smooth animations, indistinguishable from a native app, and we're using a technique that's flexible in nature. So the same principles are applied iPhone to iPad or different Android form factors where you're just coding views that know what device they're on, but are also flexible enough to present different layouts. And then I'll just talk quickly about PhoneGap versus Titanium. We started off with PhoneGap, basically working this whole thing with PhoneGap. The issue we ran into with PhoneGap was that I found that it's the JavaScript in PhoneGap is pretty poorly coded, and my guess would be that the people who originally created PhoneGap before Adobe bought it were more traditional native developers. And so I'd run into issues where, and I ended up looking into the code, PhoneGap would hijack all your touch events. Any touch event you applied to the page, PhoneGap would hijack that. As soon as I went to go play a sound, there was a bug in PhoneGap's code where the sound thing happened, and it broke everything. All the touch events stopped because PhoneGap's code completely broke. So this was in April. So I don't know if anything's changed since then. I spent a frantic weekend completely switching everything over to Titanium. And if you're not familiar with Titanium, Titanium's basically a way to write JavaScript, and then it'll compile to native views. And I don't have much experience with doing it that way because I've found I've had some success with it by basically creating a web view and then writing a bridge. So if you need access to the database, you'd be able to create a new instance of a database, but really behind the scenes, all it's doing is firing events back and forth to the native JavaScript in Titanium, which would then process that information and then send some data back. And then that's basically how to use Titanium with DOM-based JS, which is essentially create the view. You now are building it just like any other application that you'd make. So let's see, I think that might have been it. Yep, that's it. Cool. So do you have any questions?
Are you using Modernizer to detect features?
I am not. I built all that stuff into my framework. but using Modernizer to detect features, that's kind of the idea, yeah.
Is your framework available for use or anybody to look at, or is it just your own thing that you got?
I developed it at the agency I was at, and so they kind of own it right now. But I'm in the process of going freelance, so I'm going to start over, basically taking everything I learned, rebuild it from the ground up, and hopefully release it in the next few months. Yep.
Thoughts on D3?
Sorry?
D3JS?
Not familiar with it.
Just a quick question on cache for detecting, when you're detecting what type of device
Yep.
you're working on. Did you experience combating program middlewares or like Varnish, for instance, or anything like that, where your cache might not allow you to do that necessarily right away, and you might have to be working with Varnish to kind of supersede that?
No, I haven't had that issue at all. It's always pretty direct.
Okay.
How are you handling the events in your framework?
Yeah, so events. So there's two types of events. There's a pub/sub event system for global events, which is kind of rarely used, and then the framework has an internal events class. So you'd create a base UI object that would create one of those. Basically, you'd create a base UI object which would basically create this guy, and that would be its default object. I think Backbone does something similar. And then that would also inherit a localized event system, and then you'd be able to fire, you'd be able to listen to events from the parent up, and then fire events from that, bubble up as far as you want it to go. But I also found sometimes it's kind of just like a matter of interpretation as far as like where your code is at currently, because sometimes you don't want to bubble. It's like, why bubble up a million times when you can just fire like a pub event and like pub sub, and it just something else receives it, deals with it. Just a matter of like what's cleaner for that particular instance.
Is your mobile site using your framework?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just confused about some of the issues that you said you were running up against jQuery, as far as the methods and the speed issues, the latency issues. Because my understanding is, you do a selector, you get back a jQuery object. jQuery isn't throwing those methods on every element of a prototype again. It is just a wrapper. Is it necessarily the framework that's causing the memory issues?
In this case, I think so, because I'm also doing it a little differently. Keep in mind, this is happening a lot. So this instance of creating an object, styling it, setting a background image, this is happening like a bunch just when one view is happening. And that kind of has, just by nature of this, that has to happen over and over. It's a little different than just like having a block of HTML, selecting it, and then it kind of stays. Because basically, for desktop, everything's fine, no worries whatsoever. For mobile, kind of ran into, I tried it two different ways. I tried creating everything all at once and keeping it all in memory, which seems to have worked. The issue was just sometimes we were almost running up against a thing where animation was, like trying to tween things was getting a little slow because the memory was filled up. So then the next application I did, mobile still, it was more about deleting and destroying things as necessary, let the garbage collector kind of do its thing. And when that happened, having to create a lot of jQuery objects was using up a lot of memory. And I found, I kind of did like a side-by-side test where I did it kind of my own way, and I found that I wasn't having the same issues. But I still really recommend jQuery because it's awesome, and I've used it for the past few years, and it really hasn't let me down. Even the performance issues I ran into weren't necessarily like deal-breaking by any means.
Sure. And I'd like to add that 1.8 is the first version where they're doing selectively using CSS animation. It's
cool.
supported. It's working rather well, even for freeze.
Oh, awesome. Cool.
When you work with images, do you ever do things like, let's say you have an app that has to work on both like an iPad and a phone. Do you ever do things like have several different sizes of the images available for
Sure. Yeah. like especially with Retina.
Yeah.
Um,
As opposed to resizing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, never. I usually try not to resize, especially because as soon as you use image source, image width and height on an image object, the performance gets destroyed. If you try to tween that, it's just murdered. So yeah, we'll keep multiple different images. Plus, that helps because if it's non-Retina device, don't load the Retina image, that kind of stuff.
So how do you get around the hijacking all the events the problem you had with the other inside of yours?
What was the problem?
You were saying that you had a problem with Titanium because it was hijacking events.
Right.
How do you get around that in yours?
So in mine, I just don't hijack the touch events or anything. It's just like a standard. It's just like any other page that you'd use. It's like I'll give you just a quick instance. So you need to create. What's the simplest thing? Like a sound. You would go new mobile sound. It's called, and then you would tell it where the image path is. The sound path is, whether to loop, whatever. What that will do is that'll create just a simple JavaScript object that it'll create an ID saying like what's the current timestamp basically, and that's how it'll reference itself. And then it'll fire an event through Titanium, which is actually neat. It lets you communicate from the web view to the bigger Titanium wrapper. It'll fire that event saying, hey, create a sound with this ID. It'll create it, keep a reference of it, and then whenever you want it, the original sound object will have methods like play or stop or pause. And anytime those are run, that object is just firing another event saying, hey, reference this ID and stop. And then the Titanium thing will stop. And that's pretty much the whole thing. I'm not too familiar with what PhoneGap is doing because I took one look at it and I was just like, oh, all right, well, I'm not using this. So.
When you switched to Titanium, did you also switch some of the web stuff to native, or did you just stay straight web view?
Well, for maps, for the one application I mentioned before where I actually used the native map, there were certain things like Facebook integration, that kind of stuff, like where I did use the native Titanium stuff. But for views and presentations and stuff, because I was able to get pretty much native performance out of the way I was doing it, I felt pretty comfortable with that, so I stayed with using the web view for basically all the presentation layers, besides just like overlapping the map on top of the view. So I think that's all we have.